In this episode, we speak with Steve Meller, the CEO and co-founder of CH4 Global, a company whose mission is to meaningfully impact climate change at scale by developing gigatonne-scale greenhouse gas mitigation solutions for global industries and governments. In 2020, Steve Meller and his team's initial focus was methane. They had an urgent initiative to research cutting methane emissions from livestock by making a sustainable, globally scaled supply of a unique seaweed product available to the world. Steve leads a team of global business veterans with expertise in turning ambitious ideas into successful, fit-for-purpose products. Since an early retirement in late 2012 from a successful corporate executive career at P&G as Chief Innovation Catalyst, Steve has founded or co-founded 4 companies in the healthcare, tech, sustainability, and innovation sectors. I am your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the Executive Chairman of Market Insight Media and the Managing Partner of GrowthCap. He is the host of Great Entrepreneurs, a podcast for driven entrepreneurs and business owners. Our podcast covers all topics related to the entrepreneurial journey, from ideation to execution to optimization and to reaping the rewards of a well-run business. In the minutes ahead, we'll share with you unique insights and tactics from some of today's most accomplished and inspiring entrepreneurs.
Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's a delight to be with you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. So appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. We don't always have the wonderful opportunity to talk to entrepreneurs in the climate change space. So very excited for this. Maybe for the benefit of our audience, can you tell us about the particular space or niche that you play in within overall climate tech?
It's an interesting question because it's actually the convergence of really 3 different sectors, which makes it unusual. We grow a very unique species of red seaweed in very controlled land-based aquaculture. So it's an aquaculture business that has obviously all sorts of benefits, cost, performance, and environmental. We use it in the agriculture field within cattle, both dairy and beef, globally, ultimately. And so it has a significant impact there because of its reduction in methane. And then third, and how we really think of ourselves as a climate change impact company. Our goal from when we started 5 years ago was to impact climate change at scale with urgency. We've now dimensioned that to really focus on a gigaton carbon equivalent reduction by 2030.
And in its simplest form, my understanding is that this red seaweed, it's a particular, I guess, strain or form of the seaweed, species of the seaweed. By ingesting that, cows then reduce the amount of methane they put out into the environment. Do I have that correct?
You do. I'm going to give 2 qualifiers, though. One is it's an additive to their feed. So nothing changes about their feed. Whatever the nutritionists in whatever country, in whatever sector, in whatever region, and whatever farms are feeding their cows, that would continue. And this is added to their diet in conditions where they are fed, as in feedlots, of which there are now a growing number of dairies and certainly beef feedlots around the world. That's the current manifestation of the product. In next calendar year, we'll introduce a second product, which will be used for grazing dairy in particular, who have the opportunity to be introduced something once a day at a morning milking, for example, and then subsequently in the future, grazing beef that you might not see for weeks or perhaps even months. Each of those has some unique challenges, but ultimately it's an additive to the feed that they have at a very small percentage, less than 0.5% of their total daily diet. Sort of think of it like a tablespoon sprinkling on top of a bowl of cereal or something, or, an additive that you use in that context. So that's one of them. And then the other is its impact is on the very last step. So the rumen, the first stomach, contains all of these methanogenic and other bacteria that break down complex carbohydrates like grains and grasses that we can't break down, but cows do. And they break them down into effectively, let's just call them sources of energy that's absorbed into the cow, and it does what it does, produces protein for us. The very last step is the assembly of a methane molecule. And it's a simple molecule, 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens, but there's an enzymatic assembly of that. And then it's burped out. So it's a byproduct, a waste product that makes the cow less efficient, about 10% less efficient at using its calories. And the actives, and there are a range of them, about 100 of them that exist in this red seaweed, although one of them is the highest concentration, they bind and block that enzyme. So it's not magic. It doesn't do strange things. It just simply is an enzymatic block. It's very effective at doing it. And when it's blocked, methane isn't burped out. The carbon and hydrogen stay in the rumen. So the second benefit you get is that carbon's reabsorbed. Cows can be much more efficient at doing what they're doing. Often what that'll manifest in is a feed savings for the farmer. That's a financial benefit to the farmer. It costs them less feed to produce the same amount of output they have. So that's, sorry for the long way, but that's two really important qualifiers within the context of the product set.
And the effectiveness of this additive is amazing. What I understand, it's 90% reduction in methane produced.
So I think to date, the number might not be exactly right. It depends when the listeners actually hear this, but there's about 24, perhaps 25 efficacy studies that have been published over the last 7 or 8 years, independently to us by individual, primarily research groups around the world. And what we would say is up to 90%. And part of the reason we say that is the field is littered with variable results. And what we've learned, we collectively, the field, have learned that the quality of the seaweed is incredibly important in dictating that. And what I mean by that, these actives that I talked about that are in the red seaweed are normally contained, stored and concentrated in the seaweed in these things called gland cells that sit in the seaweed. They're just surrounded by a biological membrane. And so the integrity of those is critical to keep. And as you're growing it and processing it and formulating it and packaging it and doing all the things you need to get it out to a farm, you have the unfortunate opportunity to break those membranes. And if you break the membranes, these actives are what we would call volatile, meaning they want to escape into a gaseous phase and into the atmosphere. That's not a good thing all around, certainly from a product performance. And so things that people have done in the past that we weren't aware of have caused that to have lower amounts of these within the product. So when you go read some of the studies, some might say 20, 30, 40%. It's still not bad by comparison to anything else that exists, but that variability is driven primarily by the quality of the product, the processing, the amount that was in it at the time they were harvested. And that's what's contributed. We have created a product that's very, very specific, a very quality assured product release characteristic that it's always at a certain level, plus or minus 5%. So a farmer will knowingly always have. And then the other important piece is not only what it is when I manufacture it, it's what it is when you as a farmer use it. Maybe you don't get to use it for a month. It's in storage, it's on its way to you, you've sat it there. You need to make sure it's stable. The finished formulation is stable, rock solid stable. I mean, when you go to the supermarket and you buy something off of the shelf, you expect that that's going to perform the way it says it will. Same should be true for this. And again, that's not been the case because stabilizing this material once it's processed is incredibly challenging, something that we've managed, and we now have, I think, 8 months of stability on the existing product. So not only does a farmer know they're getting it on day one, they know they're getting it on 6 months if it stayed around that long in their sheds or in their barns. Incredibly important. That's what's contributed to the variability that a lot of people will refer and say, well, I don't know if this works as well. It's simply a matter of that is the major driving parameter that's important.
And I imagine where the seaweed is cultivated and its proximity to the end users is important. Where is the seaweed grown?
So today we grow it, and as I said, it's land-based aquaculture. So we don't grow it in the ocean. It's not a commercially feasible approach. Seaweed is certainly grown in the ocean and used around the world in all sorts of human and animal consumption. In this particular case, though, because you're looking to preserve these bioactives, the way that seaweed is typically processed, thrown onto the boat and just sort of sun-dried, isn't viable because that breaks down the membranes that releases these bioactives, making your product not particularly effective if you try to use it. And so being able to grow it on land allows you to control those conditions better. And you should only be growing it in regions where the species is native in the ocean around it. And there are a variety of United Nations biodiversity rules and regulations that are in place that says you shouldn't really take a species from one location and introduce it into another one where it's not either native or isn't there. So for us, the two locations we currently grow it, Australia, the southern part of Australia, and the southern part of New Zealand, is where one of the species, and there are two of them, one that likes to grow in colder waters, southern part of Australia and bottom part of New Zealand, that's called Asparagopsis armata. And then the other one likes to grow in slightly warmer, more temperate waters, like much of the Pacific, parts of the Indian Ocean, is called Asparagopsis taxiformis. Functionally, they're pretty well the same. They look a little different and they grow a little different, but functionally in the cow, they do the same thing. Asparagopsis armata is only native to the southern part of Australia and New Zealand. It's found in other parts of the world, but it's been carried there on the hulls of ships over the last 100+ years or so as international trade has gone about. So in places that it exists, like the Chilean fjords and the North Sea, off the coast of Ireland, southern tip of South Africa, and places like that, it's deemed to be both an invasive and non-native species. So from our standpoint, we grow it today in a region in which it's native. And we started the culture seed stock from material that we've selected from the ocean, and we grow it up in controlled conditions. And so for us, as we partner with large-scale organizations to bring this, one of two things will happen. We'll either supply it from our facilities in Australia and ship it. So there is a carbon cost in there, but the carbon impact is so large that's accounted for in the overall product. And or we have the opportunity to build facilities in other parts of the world that we've already done a lot of work and know are appropriate for either species. Where we grow in South Australia is unique in the world. It's the only location where both are actually native. So we have the opportunity to work with both. And as we explore these relationships, there will be locations in other parts of the world, but only in locations where the species is native.
Very interesting. And so currently, are farmers actively using the additive?
Yes, they are. So again, a difference that's, I think, important potentially for your listeners, there have been over the last 6 to 7, perhaps even stretching out to 10 years now, Asparagopsis studies that have been run. I mentioned them before, 24, 25 of them or so that have been published, and several that haven't yet been published. So farmers have been using them in context, but they've typically been in fairly controlled scientific studies, as opposed to on-farm. There have been a few on-farm more recently, so farmers have been using them, but the product or the material has been provided at no cost. So the challenge for any new industry is, will people buy it? Will people use it? That's an economically driven one, and we'll come to that, I'm sure, in one of your questions. But to come back to your question, for the first time anywhere in the world, farmers are purchasing the product from us for use in their conditions on farm. And that has started here this calendar year and is continuing to grow, as is the volumes of material continuing to grow with those farmers. So
I'd like to take a brief detour into your background and your story and how this company came to be. But maybe let's start at the beginning. I think you worked for a very notable CPG company early on in your career for quite some time.
So I think of myself as having sort of 3 different careers. I have a PhD research background from University of Adelaide in Australia, my alma mater. I left the sunny shores of Australia more than 36 years ago now, moved to the US to continue my research studies, which were unrelated to this, not in the ag field. But my PhD is a training discipline to say, how do you ask questions from a scientific approach? And so I worked at the University of Iowa for another half dozen years or so. So I had an academic career. And then I got recruited by a large CPG company, Procter & Gamble, and spent almost 2 decades there, based out of global headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio. But my role was quite divergent. For the first bit more than half of it, it was in healthcare, and ultimately was leading the R&D for healthcare. I moved into a corporate role for the second half-ish of it or so, and was deeply involved in a lot of the work the company did around open innovation, how do big companies work with small companies. Got quite deeply involved in how do companies like Procter & Gamble interact with the venture community, in particular Silicon Valley. Spent some time in Silicon Valley creating partnerships and relationships, and both on the professional and it turns out on the personal, it's where I met the woman, it's now my wife. And the third piece that I got involved in at P&G was a lot around the company's sustainability goals back in the very early 2000s. So how do big companies think about their footprint around water, waste, energy, materials, carbon, and the like. So I got very involved in facilitating how the company would achieve its 10 and 20-year goals. So all of that background turns out was important training for what my third career is, which is this entrepreneurial career. And I guess different than most, I've done it in a very different order. So a really solid science background to know how to ask the right questions to think about it. The practical issues of how do you scale things from very small to very large on a global basis and all of the nuances that are important. And now into actually building a product that requires both scientific integrity and validation and the ability to understand the path forward of how do you get to large scale and the ability to interact with big companies, who we do now, having sat on the other side. So for me, it's been a lifelong journey of learning that's actually led me to what's an incredibly personally satisfying role with building this company. So,
Mhm. And where are you located today? You have a wonderful backdrop there.
so I've lived in the US all over, as I said, Iowa, in Iowa City, at the University of Iowa, then in Cincinnati, P&G's global headquarters. I spent some time in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then after retirement, now 12 years ago, I moved out to San Francisco because that's where my wife was from. She's a PhD economist. And we lived on the peninsula just near Stanford University for almost 10 years. And about a bit more than 3 years ago, we made the decision to move out of California for a variety of reasons. And we moved, I now live in Las Vegas. I don't live on the glitz. As you can see from my screen behind me, it's the skyline of Las Vegas. We live on the side of a hill overlooking the valley in a wonderful community. It's a great place to live. We can go down to all of that glitz if we want to, go see a show or a play or a dinner. But otherwise, we live a very quiet, private life in this area. So,
Mhm. Great. Now we'll head back into CH4 Global. So I imagine it's early on in terms of market penetration and the actual percentage of the market that's actually using the product. How far are you from really launching it in earnest into the market?
so I would think of it and talk about it in again, sort of three phases. This is a scientist in me that wants to break it down into steps. And so phase one is, do you know enough about your technology and your platform and ultimately your product to know that you can consistently and confidently, reproducibly provide a product, in this case, into the market? And we've gone through that work as part of our growth phase over the last 5 years. The phase that we're in now, I think I would just call it, can you validate all of the market metrics that would be important? Is it technically valid? And I think we know the answer to that now from all of the work that we and others have done around the species. Can you sell it into a market? Will people buy it? Is there an economic equation that makes sense to them? And that's the work that we're doing now. I want to come back to address one question, one point on there. And then the third is, once you've got that initial information around market traction and market benefits, in particular financial ones, you can then move into what I would call a significant J curve, that the building up of the scaling factor for it. You know you can build a facility that can do it. You know that it's economically feasible and profitable. So when we come back to that second phase, part of where we've been, and we know today, that farmers can't withstand another cost to them. They are suffering in so many different ways around the world in a whole wide variety of industries, but in particular, when we think about here and beef and dairy, which are significant major sources of protein. And the challenge with them is they provide a pretty significant impact in terms of methane. So if we could mitigate that, which is our goal, this is a good short-term benefit to allow the world to transition its food systems, because that's not happening overnight, despite what everyone would like. We need to get there. And so mitigation of gigatons of CO2 equivalents is achievable if your product price that you sell to farmers has two pieces around it. Can the farmer make money? Can they have a net positive return on their investment? And can I make it for a cost that I can sell to the farmer so that I'm profitable? Because if I'm not profitable, I can't build larger facilities. And there's this sweet spot in the middle. And that's where we've actually worked hard for the last couple of years. And I think could give us some significant competitive advantages. And it's partly been driven by most of my leadership team have all come from Fortune 50 companies, many of them from P&G that I've worked with for decades. And so the ability to know years ago, how do we bring down costs? And we've managed to do that tenfold versus where anyone else is in this space. So it allows us to be in this sweet spot window that when I sell it to a farmer, the farmer has at least three benefits to them. A potential increase in farm gate price of their milk or their beef. It's not going to happen everywhere today, but it does in the case that we're now selling to, because we've actually lined up the rest of the value chain all the way to consumers' plates. And the second piece the farmer has the potential for is a lower feed cost. And in a feed lot, that's easier to measure and easier to validate. And that is, in fact, something that we've been seeing in here, and that contributes to the economic benefit to the farmer. And the third is there's a value to the carbon equivalents, the methane that's been reduced. And the aggregate of those three, in our case, has to be a net positive to the farmer. If it isn't, why is the farmer going to buy it? They're not. And you need to achieve that without the requirements for government subsidies. Government subsidies are not a sustainable business model. Perhaps they help at the early genesis of a model, but they're not what you should be relying upon. And again, that's a point of differentiation, I think, of where we are versus others in this space. What's also coming, though, that farmers are just beginning and countries are just beginning to realize is that regions of the world are now starting to regulate carbon emissions profiles of products. So the EU is putting in place, have already for some sectors like steel and cement, but now doing so in agricultural products, that they have to meet a certain carbon reduction profile. If they don't, they either don't come in or they pay a hefty tax. So if you are importing or exporting from a country into the EU, you stand the potential to lose that business unless you can achieve a certain level of mitigation and reduction. So that is a fourth reason, probably the largest, frankly, but not yet realized to most parts of the world, but it's absolutely happening in real time now. And so the aggregate of those needs to make the farmer money. And as I said, if we can bring costs down low enough, which we've managed to be able to do, and build a facility that is net positive profitable, now I have the opportunity to access large amounts of project capital, much like a solar farm might do, and in this particular case, different sector. But you've got to be in that sweet spot. And that's been the challenge for the industry. And I think that's why you'll start to see a number of companies in the space pull back from their ability to do it, just because it's incredibly challenging to get to that point.
We're heading into the tail end of the conversation. I have two closing questions I'd like to ask. One is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound impact on you?
So I would try to answer that slightly differently. I would say my time at Procter & Gamble was incredibly rewarding in many respects, but I learned so much more than I thought I would going. I have a PhD and I know everything about my field, and that's why they hired me, of course. Man, I didn't know anything about how the rest of the world worked in terms of building products and how you talk to customers and consumers, and how do you think about scale and the areas that are incredibly important. So the folks that I met through my journey there were, all of them collectively, incredibly influential on me as a person. It's helped modify how I live my life personally and professionally, and led me to the ability to really be where we are as a company. So I would say it's a company as opposed to an individual. So
Last question, can you tell us about a charity, cause, or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
So I am a 3-time cancer survivor. And as a result of some of those treatments, it significantly affected my immune system dramatically. And the mechanisms seem to be unknown. And so my passion is, how do we think about, and as a health scientist, PhD trained person as well, it's something that I spend a bit of time on, both personally and as the company moves along its phases and I move to a different part of the phase of it, that will become part of what I will be wanting to do. How do we help survivors, but also people who have unknown parts of it, in particular around the immune dysfunction pieces, and how do we get them to be seen and recognized and ultimately treated? So it's a growing field, because as we get older and as we introduce more and more things into the water streams and the atmosphere that probably shouldn't be there, it's going to continue to affect us. So, that's an area that I have a significant passion and time for. So.
Fantastic. Well, Steve, want to thank you for taking the time. This has been a wonderful conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. So appreciate it.